Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. And our focus today for our Peace, Compassion and Empathy reading group, I've chosen this article. I'm hoping it will come now into view. And I'm guessing that you may not have read this, so I'll quote a bit from it as I go through. But this article came up as I was preparing the literature review for our upcoming issue in Language, Context and Text, and trying to look at the whole body of work done in systemic functional linguistics and social semiotics, and in particular looking for how empathy is dealt with in our discipline. I also wanted to look at, sorry, I'm mingling with my screen, sorry, fiddling around. I also wanted to consider one of the pieces of work that our PCEC group has done is to work towards a linguistic description of each of those terms of interest. So to consider peace, compassion, and empathy. As the PCEC project has developed, beyond Elizabeth's initial inspiration, we've broadened our reach from a strictly linguistic lens to looking out to semiotics, to multimodality. And so I was interested and sparked a bit by this article to consider if we can work towards a semiotic description of empathy as well. I mean, I know that's not really how glossaries work, but I thought it could be particularly relevant for this one of the three concepts, more relevant for empathy than for compassion or peace, possibly to consider the multimodal resources that construe it as well. So as I said, this article by Morten Burris, and Daniel, I don't know if you're aware of the University of Southern Denmark from your work. Would I be right in describing it as a sort of a hotbed of multimodality in the north? So Morten Burris, the author of the article for today, he's an associate professor in visual communication at the University of Southern Denmark. Theo van Leeuwen headed the Centre for Multimodality there for several years. I don't know if that still exists. And from what I've seen from different parts of literature emerging from the University of Southern Denmark, as well as that focus on sociolinguistics and multimodality, there are researchers in cognitive linguistics and psychology and projects that sort of meld each of those topics together. The university is in Odense. Daniel, again, you can probably correct me, which is the birthplace of Hans Christian Andersen. And I was so happy to go there for the International Conference of Multimodality in 2018. It's a beautiful conference. Both Kress and Van Leeuwen were keynotes there. And we started each day with a song from the Højskole Sangbogen, the high school songbook, sorry, to all Danes. which was actually tremendous and should be compulsory at all conferences. Just saying. So Associate Professor Boris works at the University of Southern Denmark. He was the editor of the journal Visual Communication for a number of years. He was an editor with others of a festschrift for Theo van Leeuwen called Advancing Multimodal and Critical Discourse Studies. And his particular area of focus is photography, which he teaches to students there, semiotics of photography. And this article, which is from 2021, published in 2021, is relevant to our consideration of empathy because it picks up the formulation of visual truth in a social semiotic concept of visual validity and applies it to modern digital photography, the kind that we see every day with every young person with a smartphone. So this article, I chose it because it was a non-linguistic addressing of the idea of empathy, and I hoped that it might contribute towards a possible semiotic description of the word, expanding that linguistic description. So I've got 3 questions to consider. Please interrupt at any time, especially if I am not making sense or if you disagree violently or even mildly with me. So my 3 questions on the right side of the screen are really based on considering empathy as a concept in opposition to other terms. Halliday says, he was talking about syntax, but he says a word can be understood by the company it keeps, which I think is a beautiful idea. You know, there's the word, you know, very clubbable, down at the pub with its friends, having a nice cup of tea. But I think it's also true that you can know the word by its enemies as well. So this is my springboard for considering empathy in multimodality and in letting you know how the article develops this new non-linguistic idea of empathy. So my first question is, does empathy only accompany sadness? Elizabeth wrote a linguistic description of empathy, and it doesn't say that, although one of the sources that you drew on, Elizabeth, was a handbook of philosophy, and it says that empathy is most commonly associated with witnessing and responding to sad events happening to others. Empathy in general terms, outside our group, can be seen as a part of a set of closely related terms. So I was looking at a scholar of ancient Greek emotions. Douglas Cairns, he says compassion, sympathy, empathy, and pity, and their analogues, where they exist in other languages, constitute a family in which resemblances are often really rather close in practice, even if particular members of the group pass in and out of fashion and take on a range of different connotations at different periods and different contexts. He was talking about the ancient Greek word eleos. So he's wanting to talk about noble pity, for example, in Homer and Plato. And he relates this to a term used by Judith Butler when she's discussing how nations mourn their own dead, but not the dead of other nations, grievability. So in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen is an image of the Greek heroes carrying the warrior Patroclus off the battlefield. He's dead. And in the centre, I picked a corresponding image. This is Albert Tucker, a drawing of a young man in 1942, traumatised from his war experiences. And the title of this image, which is in the War Memorial here in Canberra, is Psycho. So these images, this central image is, I think, an example of how intensely sad images and narratives are so marked that it seems to sort of steal away empathy into that feeling of deep sadness in response. So, and we've got an example here of that, the demand of the pictured soldier insisting on concentration on his suffering and empathetic response. Now, Marshall Rosenberg, whose work on nonviolent communication was a major influence on our founder in setting up this group, has a discussion on how this kind of sympathy really is antagonistic to the empathy that he's talking about. So he sees an expression of sympathy as stopping empathy, stopping an empathetic relationship with the person. He says it can come later in the communication, but the first thing is not to analyse the person you're speaking to, not to say, I understand, but to just be with them. And I think that could link to my next question there, which is, can there be such a thing as fake empathy? The Burris article talks about reality in terms of the realness of photography. I'm just going to move to a timeline which I created from Burris's article, and I've added to it, hoping you can see this. So the first section, Burris's article. Oh, Daniel, am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah, your Danish pronunciation sounds really good to me. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
I mean, I speak Norwegian, so it's slightly different.
Yes,
but yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay, I'll keep saying it that way then. So Burris starts his discussion of the photograph and its relation to the reality of the world with, as a timeline point, 1846. So Fox Talbot writing about the new idea of photography as pencils of nature. So really delighting in that idea that photography presents you with a completely immediate, unmanipulated, direct representation of reality. So that sort of scientific accuracy, its faithfulness to the natural world. That's at the starting point of Burris's discussion of photography. He takes us right through to the present day and talks about drawing on work, 2016 work of Dubois as his warrant. He's talking about the rise of the regime of visuality over textuality. So as photography has expanded in its possibility and its reach as a mode, along with the extraordinary impact of film, beginning of the 20th century, we see a sort of, Burris believes, we're seeing, and others, we're seeing a great shift from that ideational faithfulness to a much stronger, interpersonal faithfulness, and photography and the image becoming the preferred way to communicate. Many, he would say. He notes, so Photoshop, the application, was introduced in 1989, and Burris explains how its introduction added fuel to this sort of raging debate about how photography at that stage, at this modern phase of photography, how it relates to the real world. And this is described as the loss of indexical innocence. So photography can no longer just be taken at face value. We're reading it in a very different way. And you can see we now use Photoshop as a verb very happily. And it's not an image that's been Photoshopped is not always what we would say a faithful representation. But Burris is against that sort of counterpoint of fakeness. Burris is explaining Kress and van Leeuwen's idea of visual validity. So sorry, I should have left the timeline up to show you the editions of reading images. So Kress and van Leeuwen's extraordinarily influential book. First edition was 1990, the next 1996. The third edition came out in 2020, and there the term that they'd previously used from Halliday, modality, they then reformulated as a question of validity, of visual validity. So for Halliday, modality is the resourcing grammar that deals with the uncertainty as expressed in the judgment of the speaker. And Kress and van Leeuwen are saying modality is not a question of absolute truth, but a matter of how true a given statement is represented to be. And I liked this extension of that idea. They say modality produces shared truths, aligning readers or listeners with some statements and distancing them from others. It serves to create an imaginary we. So Burris takes up this concept of visual validity to discuss what kind of truthfulness is represented in photos that can now be so manipulated. He explains how the ready availability, everybody has an iPhone or something similar, and the highly refined software that runs on it makes it possible for huge populations, particularly in the Western world, to easily manipulate photos. And he reflects in the article on how this big surge in taking photos, iPhones, being able to change the photo on your iPhone, edit it how you wish, add to it. He's seen that as that's become part of students' everyday lives, it's sort of transformed their understanding of that semiotic resource of modality. they now are perfectly able to analyse validity as a strategic communicative resource, he says, but whereas 20 years ago, he would have had a great deal of difficulty explaining that to them. The central part of the article discusses how manipulated photos make possible different realities. And he talks about the surreal effects of filters. So it's now possible to do things like this to yourself on Snapchat or indeed in Zoom, so that you can so that it becomes that whether photos taken without a filter are now a noticeable choice. So that the hashtag no filter is sort of a marked choice, that if you're saying this is something naturalistic, no filters have been used, it's faithful to nature, thinking back to that, the early days of photography. So that's another sign contributing to the idea that the visual is on the rise, the sensory is on the rise. This is a formulation of Kress and van Leeuwen. They also say that you can see this shift to a different coding orientation. Bernstein's 5 coding orientations include one for sensory coding, and here aided by technology. So Burris states in the article, the camera is in fact not separate from the body. It is as close to the body as it can get. So he's thinking about how the photo taker has their phone in their hand, they're sending it to the recipient, whose camera is in exactly the same sort of physical relationship as the photo maker. This is a whole new sort of semiotic arrangement for the last 20 years. And he wants to say that the camera is like a kind of extra perception device. So it's like one of our senses. And he takes that idea of visual validity presented by Kress and van Leeuwen a little bit further. He wants to talk in this context about emotive validity. So we don't need to say, we don't need to express in words our experience, because the camera allows us to experience the companion's feelings directly, camera to camera. And he describes this sort of extension of the camera as a part of our sensory organs as the eye in the hand. He takes this further. Let me show you the timeline again. He's drawing on to refine further that concept of visual validity. He's drawing on a use by quite an old paper now, Abercrombie. It's a discussion of the elements of phonology. And I've got a quote there. I'll just expand on that. The speaker is simultaneously also hearer. The hearer is, in a way, simultaneously also speaker, insofar as he empathically enters into the speaker's sound-producing movements. sometimes even making tentative movements of a similar nature himself. Recognition of this identity of speaker and hearer, or phonetic empathy, is important in understanding various problems in the perception of speech, particularly in connection with its rhythmic features, and it provides an additional reason why speech is not listened to as other sounds are. So that's the original, the Abercrombie original. So Burris picks up on this idea, phonetic empathy, and wants to describe the way that the emotions of others reverberate with our own emotions through this photography as photographetic empathy. And a colleague research team at University of Southern Denmark and elsewhere use the same Abercrombie source, phonetic empathy idea, to talk about graphetic empathy. And there they're talking about, well, this article, which is the same year as our one today. They talk about, can the sort of recipient, can the reader of a handwritten work understand from the way that the handwriting's done, or the way that the drawing is done, can they get that extra understanding of the feeling of the person who made those marks? Sorry, it's not a very good description. Interesting article, very focused on that idea about, they find it can, they say, but again, another example of communication of empathy, but asynchronously and at a distance. So so that idea about photographetic empathy, it's situated in the idea that being empathetic means being able to simulate another's emotions or another's emotionally caused actions, and experiencing simulations of the experience of emotions in ourselves. This is Galese's work. We understand each other's sensations from that imitation and mirroring. We feel it inside ourselves. And that idea brings me to my last question about the relationship between linguistic and non-linguistic resources in expressing empathy, which I have not very seriously called "Do You Say It Best When You Say Nothing at All?" which is a song from my childhood. When I picked up this article first, I thought that that's what I might find from it, that it's a way of empathy being given existence without words. And I wondered about that sort of underlying history in discussion of social semiotics and multimodal discourse analysis. It's sort of a competition between modes. Is the verbal language the primary medium of meaning making, or is it multimodality? Again, reflecting that claim by Kress and van Leeuwen that textuality is giving way to visuality. And then perhaps the ideational is giving way to the interpersonal. So I wondered if, when we're looking at empathy, is a non-verbal resource, is that non-verbal more a superior resource? Is empathy something that's ineffable, incapable of being spoken? Would non-verbal communication just do a better job. And that's in part, I think, related to the idea that empathy is a sort of fantasy emotion. Sarah Ahmed characterizes empathy as a wish feeling. You empathize with someone's pain. She's taking that sadness idea. So you empathize with someone's pain, and the important thing is that you are not in pain. So you're being affected by something that we don't know anything about. This is, Rosenberg would agree, you can't say, I understand how you're feeling. That is not the point of empathy. One of the interesting stories that Rosenberg does tell about empathy, he calls the radical power of empathy. He describes a product designer who wanted to know what it was like to be an old person in the city. So instead of asking people, she actually dressed up, she fully dressed up as an 85-year-old. So she got a stick, she got an old coat and an old hat. She sort of immobilized some of her joints so that she'd shuffle along. And that she felt transformed her understanding. She embodied the person, so she was able to relate without words to that experience entirely. And I think that idea about simulation, I really respond to it because in my work, in my day job, working with teachers who are using technology to help the students learn, thinking particularly of a nursing lecturer who does something quite similar. She has a whole kit, including a sort of a big plastic mask, really quite high tech, dresses up as an older lady, and she takes on the role of a retired nurse who's turned up at the hospital. She presents herself to her students as a patient, and they need to work with her, including, she's a bit deaf and she's got her own opinions, but she's a nurse, so she can help them if the students get into trouble. This lecturer actually came to discuss this at a technology conference we were running in Canberra, and I didn't know she was coming. And this old lady turns up at the registration desk when I was on, and I was really confused because she was so realistic. But the simulation's tremendously effective in her teaching and in developing students' abilities to emotionally respond to patients as well. So to develop their sense of empathy, to make it easy for them to both understand the condition and understand the patient simultaneously. And we actually know from reviews of simulation that students actually learn better from that fake situation than they do from being really on practice, because they can concentrate on learning a specific thing at a time. So I'd be interested in discussing this further, how empathy is positioned in that question of verbal or non-verbal. And I was looking at that idea that actually Halliday and Matheson reject in construing experience through meaning, which is a very interesting book for a historical overview of some of the concepts of linguistics that aren't in the core part of systemic functional linguistics. So they're talking about the question of language as distortion. So, and is one of the answers to that problem of language as distortion, that images can mean better than language. I think that is also a live issue when we're looking to define empathy in semiotic terms. So I've slightly critiqued that idea of the glossary item, but what is, I think, very interesting, perhaps just as a final point, is that one of the sources that glossary cites is this, now along the timeline in the centre, in the swap over from the 19th to the 20th century, empathy arose as a term for appreciating art. It's a translation of here, Einfühlung, so which is understanding, empathy, and sensitivity, as far as that allows you to respond to art. And drawing back on an earlier discussion of aesthetics from Hegel, art is in truth the primary instructus. So I'll just, I'd be very happy to show you more about my interesting timeline, but I just thought that it was particularly interesting that the word has sort of gone a full tour from being part of the way that you look at a realistic or a romantic image. This is the period we're talking about here, and how that is now a concept that can possibly describe the art of our current technologies. So photographetic empathy. And I would welcome your thoughts.
Wow, thank you, Penny. You've given enough food for thought for months. Rich and thought-provoking, lots of questions. I have a number of questions, but I'll open it to the floor first. But just before I do, I just want to note that despite your anxiety and your nerves, you presented in a clear and careful way, and I'm very grateful for that. So.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for embodying your particular
boom, boom.
what Elizabeth's job is.
So, opening it up to the floor. Anybody have any questions for Penny?
Lovely to see you, Horatio, too. Hello, Nicole.
Thank you. I would like to start with a primary question, just to ensure I'm understanding something foundational. Are we saying that the person who is going to receive empathy is sharing the art, or is it the person who's giving the empathy is sharing art?
So taking it from face-to-face communication to using an image or a technology to spark empathy, from that, I think it's focused on the person who's having the in-feeling, who's the mode is talking to me, and I'm experiencing empathy because of what is depicted. So it may be, so camera to camera, it's simultaneous possibly, or, you know, a little time between sending the image and receiving the image. But that is me understanding the person who sent it. This is true because this is how I'm really feeling. I can directly see how the person's feeling. So in Burris's view, then the relationship is one of empathetic communication. So I know I recognize exactly this is real. This is the reality of the feeling that this person's conveying, because they've manipulated the image the way they've decided to take it, what they've decided to show to me. So it's a sort of a validation of our communication. But yeah, the empathy is a feeling in me that is the communication that makes that relationship between me and the person who is talking to me, sending me a photo, or has made me a beautiful 19th century painting, which I can only appreciate in that last example I was showing you, where that word empathy first entered English from German. That I can only appreciate art if I have that feeling. So it's all about me, really, in this term. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'm understanding. It is all about me. We're not necessarily going to convey to the artist that we have understood or what we have understood. It's just focusing on the empathy occurring inside of me.
And so we sort of have a connection with the painter, perhaps through the depicted object, but it's a different, you know, because of the technology, a different way than what Burris is discussing, camera to camera, sensing organs, communicating phenomena directly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, Penny.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Daniel does.
Yes, go, Daniel. Go first.
You sure? I can
Yeah.
wait.
Elizabeth was just a pity question in case nobody else spoke.
But I guess my question, thanks first of all, Penny. I really enjoyed that presentation and the summary of the paper. I'd read through it beforehand, but I must admit I've skim read it. So I skimmed it. So
thank you, Daniel.
It was quite nice to get some kind of points clarified there. And I loved the timeline, by the way. That was really nice. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I'll show you more of that later.
Yeah, great. The question I had doesn't strictly relate to empathy, but like this other idea that Boris raises in the article, and I was kind of interested about your thoughts on that. You mentioned coding orientation and this emotive coding orientation that he proposes, and that he makes distinct from the sensory coding orientation that, for example, Kress and Van Leeuwen talk about. And I'm just wondering, so when I read that, I was trying to make sense of it, because he seemed like he was positioning that coding orientation almost between the naturalistic and the sensory, and saying that it was something else, maybe a combination of the two. I'm just kind of curious as to how you see that fitting with those other two, and
yes,
maybe also what is there a need for that proposal, or how yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Because I read it quickly and I paused for a moment and thought, oh, this is interesting. But then my immediate response was, well, isn't this just sensory coding orientation? But perhaps I missed something.
I think he's saying it is. I think he's taking that idea of Kress and Van Leeuwen quite seriously. I've just go back to my timeline just momentarily, because this is not an idea of Burris's, but I am interested in this as a possible and slight answer to your question. I suppose what is problematic for me is trying to separate out those different cycles, to say photography mainly ideational, in modern terms, perhaps mainly interpersonal, to think about the cycle sort of dominated by, mainly facilitated by technology of was textual, is now visual, is now multimodal. So I find it hard. I'm confusing those both in my thinking. I'm trying to work out which, I'm trying to work out their relationships, because I was a bit sort of provoked in the 4th edition of Halliday's Grammar. I just want to show you, saying that that you know what orientation a text has because of its question, what field it's in, so that you know that a history book will use a timeline, and you know that a chemical procedure will use a flowchart or something. So that it's because of what it's about that those choices about multimodal or visual combinations are made. And I would say that Burris's article contributes the idea that it's not just the field, but it's also the tenor that's making. So these terms are sort of sitting side by side. It seems to me that the historical shift is happening in both these areas. And I don't know if anybody has I find it quite persuasive, this idea that I've just put this at the bottom of the timeline, that there's a parenthesis, 2009 work describing the Gutenberg parenthesis, where things were totally oral, printing arrives, we get right into that. There's a lot of, it's sort of contemporaneous with the rise of the scientific revolution, with the importance of the ideational and the sort of decline of the rhetorical. And now, and especially I think now with, this year with ChatGPT, I think that we're really seeing that parenthesis close off. So now that texts can be created by computers, fairly unmediated, possibly by humans, perhaps we're in a different world where things have to be oral to be real. I don't know. But this is, sorry, so Daniel's no answer. But I see that these areas are interwoven in this article and elsewhere, and I'd love to sort it out in my head a bit more. I don't think it was a very bad answer, but it's something that I'm interested in. I'd like to find out more.
Are you ready for the pity question? So I kind of had 2 requests. There are 3 questions that you asked. I'm not sure I know where you landed.
Yeah. So the questions were, is empathy always about sadness? No. And that source that you referred to in the glossary, that empathy is a term of art, it is actually what you need to appreciate art. Totally out of sad, it's totally, beyond any sadness. It's very pure. So looking at its etymological roots, absolutely not. But looking at general usage, like all words, it goes through a cycle of change. And like I said, I think that people conflate it with sympathy because they haven't thought about it very strongly, and because the impact of images, that it's the sadness that gets to it. I was thinking also, was it Rosenberg, Elizabeth, you showed us in a workshop a sequence of photos that people had taken, and he also took one of himself. Am I getting, was that the right person? You showed us a video. Anyway, it just seemed to me that if it was Rosenberg, he was communicating the idea, the importance of empathy a lot better through showing this sequence of different photos of people in the street and his own photo.
Ah,
Do you remember this
no,
video?
that was me.
Oh, it wasn't you, but it was done a lot more effectively through that sequence of photos than by his text, obviously. We just respond better. So the question, do you say it best when you say nothing at all? His stories too, in the book Nonviolent Communication, he describes a case, very traumatized young woman, wouldn't speak, sort of psychological condition, wouldn't speak at all. He sat with her, he talked for her, he tried to say what he felt she was saying. And eventually it was his touch of her hand that was the key to unlocking. She was able to get a sentence out then in his clinical office. So he doesn't make the point that it was touch, but that was a very, very, it was a very powerful case story. So, and then the other question about fake empathy. I'd love anyone's thoughts on that idea that it's harder to argue with an image than it is with a text. So that idea that modality is an indication of how the speaker's judgment, expectations, how negotiable the representation is, that Burris is taking up from Kress and Van Leeuwen as well. Can it be fake if it's saying it's fake? It's partly fake. If it's saying, don't look at this for the truth of representation, look at this for the truth of my feeling. So is it possible, I don't know, is it possible to say that an expression of empathy via a multimodal resource, is it possible to argue with the speaker's presentation of that, with the speaker's statement about how valid it is?
Yeah, I guess thinking about it, it's putting fakeness to a particular social purpose, and so therefore it's got a role to play because it's somehow representational of somebody's emotional state. That's it. Is that what you mean?
I'd love to have said that, but that's what I mean.
Yeah, so fake's really the wrong word. If you put things to work for a purpose, then I guess.
Well, and what the truth that you're talking about, it's now more believed that.
And it's not an ideational truth necessarily; it's an interpersonal or personal truth.
Yep. And Burris also quotes Kress and Van Leeuwen to say that that it is increasingly believed that human action is essentially driven by emotions. So they've said that in the third edition, Reading Images. I would love to think more about how, I didn't get to talk about this, but I'd love to hear your views on this too. Is empathy different from the other two terms in that it demands an action, or is it, as it was originally formulated, as an art appreciation? It is.
What are the other two?
Just a feeling. Oh, peace and I just mean peace and compassion.
Peace and compassion.
Yeah, as versus peace and compassion does empathy. Has empathy got a connotation that action might follow? It doesn't in the art appreciation world. It sort of does in Rosenberg, and it does in Kress and van Leeuwen if you consider their pretty radical insistence that images do things. You know, they are actions. So, yeah.
Mm.
So I didn't talk about that. Already talking far too long, but you know, I wanted to look at. I'd love to. That it feels to me that that's part of it. That it's not just a feeling response, but it is an action response. But perhaps that belongs to compassion as well. I just don't know.
Well, that would go to Arnie's argument that compassion. Arnie, I'm speaking for you here,
Yes,
and possibly putting words into your mouth. But compassion is end result of compassion is some kind of act to relieve suffering. Over to you, Arnie.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, spot on. So what I'm arguing for, and what the literature is supporting as well, is that if we don't end up with an action that leads to material results, then we don't have compassion. So it's not enough for a doctor to be to have empathy, but a patient needs an action and to feel the results of that empathy. So that action resulting in a change in status quo or alleviating the pain, that is the compassion.
Mm.
So empathy comes first to help arouse the emotional impetus and the push. But if that is not followed by action and results, then we don't have compassion.
Yes, so no action is required in regarding a work of art, except to revel in the experience inside you of that in-feeling. But only with my nursing lecturer all dressed up as an old lady, even with simulated vagina, that she can help the students, you know, practice such an important skill to intimately examine people. How is she going to make that possible? She gives them the practice of working with an older lady in a perfectly safe, controlled situation in a simulation. She lets them allow their empathy to emerge, and then they can act compassionately in a real situation when they're really with their old patients, with their
Mm. Goodness.
So she's nurturing. She's making it possible for them to overcome their disgust and other feelings, to have a more pure, you know, a more functional approach.
Yeah. Well, I think there continues to be a mix-up between empathy and compassion in some discussions, but that's why we are coming up with this project to provide solid foundation from an SFL perspective. Because even in newspapers, when they were talking about New Zealand Prime Minister, for example, in response to 2019 attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch, they described her as an empathic leader. Well, that theoretically applies to the extent she expressed herself in solidarity with the families, but that did not stop there. She took actions. She stood next to them, reimbursed them, hold that perpetrator accountable for what he what he did. So a lot of actions were taken afterwards to reassure people. It's not enough to say, I'm standing with you. So that was followed by a lot of compassionate actions. So to continue to describe her only as a person with heightened empathy, for example, I think there is a mix-up between empathy and compassion when it comes to newspaper descriptions there. That's why visiting corpora and further texts that use these terms help us in elucidating confusion in this regard.
Absolutely understand what you're saying, Arnie. I'm thinking about how she's representing to elicit empathy from the general public. So she's adopting a Muslim headscarf because she's wanting to represent her solidarity. So would you accept that she's providing an exemplar of empathy as a starting point before the actions, in order to legitimate her actions, perhaps with using public funds, whatever? Would that be a viable thought?
Yeah, well, that instance you just mentioned, I'll take it as an instance of empathy. Yeah. So you show,
and she's wanting to infuse that. She's wanting to get that empathetic response from the public as well.
So her interest is in getting them to experience empathy, not necessarily to act, but then when it comes to the way they would approach an elderly patient, that their empathetic understandings or their empathetic experience gives them the capacity to act compassionately.
Yeah, as Arnie said, it has, and Rosenberg, it comes first, empathy first, but what does it mean in the real world of action? What does it mean without compassion? Right, Arnie?
Marshall would be clear in saying empathy isn't about, or offering empathy and experiencing it that's as far as it goes. You're holding the person, you're not then giving them advice or doing something to them or making a suggestion there, or that goes to that's outside the bounds of offering an empathetic ear and giving the person the time and space to express themselves, whether it's with the phone or with text or nothing, language or somatic.
Yeah. I mean, another interesting paper by Burris, which I'd really recommend, or I'd like to read it further, is how technology speeds that up, like speeds up new symbolic meaning. So we now all know what this filter means or what this hashtag means, and or how this image can be read. So I don't, I'd like that's his starting point. I'd love to read it further and see if he thinks that contributes to more real feeling in the world, or if, like we experienced in 2020, 2021, having somebody's face right in front of you in a Zoom meeting for hours and hours doesn't lead to a great sense of empathy. In fact, it depersonalizes us. I thought there's ways in, I just thought that was a sort of a counterpoint to Burris's idea about technology enabling such swift empathy, was how it also, there's also that live topic of, do you need to be physically present with the person? Like, is a digitally mediated contact, does it destroy some aspects of empathy? So, yeah.
could comment on that too, but I feel like I'm a hog. Would anybody else like to ask questions of Penny or throw in a thought?
Expand the discussion. It doesn't have to be.
I am eager to just throw in one thought on the empathy as a feeling or an action. I recently heard Sarah Payton, neuroscientist, say something about empathy changes us. So for me, that's somewhere between a feeling and an action, because it changes our very perception of the world. Maybe it will change the way we act. It changes our priorities. So I just wanted to throw that in there, into that kind of binary about feeling and action.
It's beautiful, Nicole. And I guess that's why I think about the nursing educator, because I'm thinking about empathy as part of the character development. She's not just teaching the students how to nurse. She's teaching them how to be a nurse, how to care. So, and the role of empathy in education, I think, is something interesting.
I think it's not necessarily an action to be changed, but as in empathy changes us. We're receiving some somatic response to what's going on with another person, and then somehow there's this exchange of that somatic response, and we can impact each other with or without language. Just how it works, Penny, the whole idea of here's how I feel in a phone, in an image in a phone, and the other person can see it, and because there's an understanding between them, they can understand each other very quickly or instantaneously, and you can probably feel the effect. Each of you could probably feel the somatic effect almost instantly.
Yeah, and that question about does language interfere? So Kress and Van Leeuwen also want to talk about more than real in what images make possible, and the ideal. I mean, this is all part of their consideration of visual validity.
Yeah, well, I think this leads us to think about empathy and compassion in the discourse of manipulation. So manipulative discourses, persuasive discourses, and why would an author or a designer choose an image or another, or choose some kind of language? Of course, there are some ideological purposes behind the use of these resources, and we cannot ignore that. That's why probably we are focusing in our project on the positive side, positive discourse analysis. So we don't want to challenge that discourse that is legitimating or delegitimating or whatever. So we are in support of social justice cases in a way or another, and we assume that we are dealing with instances of genuine, probably compassion, real compassion. So in the corpus analysis, we saw some instances of real compassion, fake compassion, or genuine compassion. Again, it depends on the cases we are looking at. So if people are defending universal human rights, then that will be obvious what we're talking about. The same applies, for example, if we are fighting for animals' rights, for example. Daniel may love to add to this, but again, the idea of fake or faux empathy and faux compassion, this idea is there, and corpus analysis shows that yes, there is some kind of description. Again, this might be an area for another project where we look at empathy, compassion, and peace, probably in different type of discourse, in political discourse, for example, in violent extremist discourse, because even violent extremists claim that we are doing what we are doing violently because we care for our in-group. So yeah, but we are not operating within that realm for the time being, I imagine. Yeah, I just wanted to mention this.
And yeah, and also they're looking to a different world, the same idea, they're looking for a different possible world. So they have to draw on the imaginative resources of the people that they're speaking to, that they're writing for, that they're showing their videos to, in order to achieve that, the possibility.
Yeah, if you use GPT-4, for example, and you insert prompts like Trump and Biden hugging each other, you'll find that image will be produced instantly, and you can use it to manipulate people's perception of the politics and what's going on in the United States. So yes, of course, you can use these semiotic resources to stimulate certain responses. And if we look at these responses as actions, or the influence of the use of these resources as action, that action is different from a material action that we do to help a poor, for example, by giving them something to eat. So looking at action as a social and discursive action, such as racist discourse, for example, it is considered by Van Dyck, who's not a cephalist, but yeah, he's considering this type of discourse as a social and discursive action, because while reading this kind of discourse, something changes in our mind, either our perception of the world, or probably we get incited, encouraged to do something against people coming from out groups. So something is changing. That is probably what is people in pragmatics call perlocutionary act. It is, yeah, it is. So when you incite violence or hatred, you pursue some change in people's mind, attitudes, and worldview. So that kind of social and discursive action. But when it comes to action in relation to compassion, and probably we discussed some examples related to war in Vietnam. So a pilot who saw that his colleagues were bombarding or killing children in that village. So that view, that scene aroused some feelings inside him and encouraged him to interfere and stop bombarding that village and then rescuing the children. So this kind of action is what is considered compassion in the literature. Yeah.
Okay. Just noticing the time, we've scheduled to go to 12:30. 12:30. So we've got a little more time. Is there any further questions?
Can I just clarify, Ami? So you said so that pilot's actions in the literature is considered compassion. Is that, would you consider that, you know, from your studies. Is that a compassionate action on his part from what your researchers turned up?
Well, luckily I'm looking at texts. So I'm not looking at people who previously volunteered to be part of a war against a country and then being moved by the scenes there. But yeah, that example was mentioned in a textbook that argues for this sociocognitive approach to compassion, where in real life we find ourselves in situations where we are pushed by the sad reality people are experiencing, and we find ourselves in a position that we need to step in, we need to help. So this notion is now moved to discourse, so we can do that in language, not only by witnessing these real world scenarios.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Any final?
So Horatio's just in the chat, Elizabeth,
Sorry, I'm
talking about embodied mind, which is such a great point.
do you want to read it, Penny?
Yes, so Horatio's comment, I found the idea of photographetic empathy quite interesting, making a connection with the notion of extended mind and more broadly with embodied mind. Shapiro proposes this with respect to extended mind or extended cognition. Extended cognition moves from the claim that cognition is embedded to claim additionally that the environmental and social resources that enhance the cognitive capacities of an agent are in fact constituents of a larger cognitive system. So rather than merely useful tools for a cognitive system that retains its traditional location wholly within an agent's nervous system. Horatio, you'll be interested perhaps in the graphetic empathy, where they're talking very much about externalizing. So a sort of contradiction to that definition about externalizing the action onto the traces. They want to focus on the offloading of that. Sorry, Horatio, continuing. Then I think that an idea of embodied extended empathy makes more sense than a simulated empathy. That's such a good point. So the use of our own mind to simulate the mental emotional state of another. So that's a tremendous comment, taking that idea about fakeness further, that it's, would it be right, Horatio, in saying, so yes, so it would be interesting to think about how one extended mind interacts with the other through that system.
Fascinating. I like that embodied.
Yes, I've actually got, that's one of the quotes on my door. 1 second.
And Penny's caught up for a moment.
Sorry, it isn't that relevant, but just talking about enacting social cognition. So how that, again, one of these big shifts, perhaps, from a social world pre-Gutenberg, an individualized cognition during the Gutenberg parenthesis. Perhaps we're coming out of that again with that idea of extended mind, social cognition, technology enabling greater interaction, greater interpersonal communication. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to think of it like that. We're now in a new era of some kind of.
Anyway, I let Professor Burris know that we were reading this today, and he said, absolutely, he's right now working on that area of ChatGPT and how that relates to photo manipulation. So these creations. And I did put stable diffusion as the end point of my timeline at the moment, but yeah, which is one of those deep image generation machine tools.
And what did you call it? Sorry, Penny.
That's the name of the application, stable diffusion. So it's yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you, Penny, for absolutely thought-provoking and deeply interesting presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Horatio, for sharing that article.
Yes, there's an article that we'll download.
Excellent. That is so great. Not SFL, but so interesting and so relevant. Yeah.
Do you have any final closing comments, Penny?
No, I just wanted to give you Professor Burris's best wishes. He says, what an absolutely beautiful theme you have for your interest group. So, yeah.
Isn't that nice?
Yes.
Well, you'll be able to send him this recording.
Oh, good Lord. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening so patiently.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
And it was a great discussion to follow. Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, probably a special thank you for those who joined us for the first time, and hopefully we'll continue to have more and more people in our meetings. So I think using social media is helping us already, reaching out to people. And yeah, a special thank you to everyone who's here.
Great.
Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Lovely to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.